Close your eyes and imagine a mansion in Florida. Palm trees sway in the warm breeze. The sound of water lapping against a private dock drifts through the afternoon air. Inside, an old man sits by the pool, fishing rod in hand, staring at the water. But there are no fish in this pool. There never have been. The man doesn't seem to notice. He sits there for hours, waiting for a catch that will never come. Sometimes he talks to people who aren't there. Sometimes he forgets his own name. He's only 45 years old, but he looks ancient grey, withered, confused. 15 years earlier, this same man controlled an entire city. He had more money than he could count, more power than most politicians, more fame than movie stars. Presidents knew his name. Newspapers put his face on the front page. When he walked down the street, people whispered and pointed. Some in fear, some in awe. But now he sits alone, fishing in an empty pool, his mind shattered, his empire gone, his legend fading into memory. How does a man fall so far? How does someone go from ruling a city to fishing for ghosts in a swimming pool? And more importantly, how did he rise so high in the first place? This is a story about America in the early 1900s, when the government made a decision that would change everything. A story about a boy from Brooklyn who saw an opportunity that no one else could see. A story about violence and money, loyalty and betrayal, ambition and destruction. It's the story of 3 scars on a man's face, and how those scars became the mark of the most notorious criminal in American history. It's a story about what happens when you break all the rules and get away with it, until you don't. So settle in, relax, and let me tell you how an immigrant's son became a king, and how that king ended up fishing in an empty pool, waiting for something that would never come. This is the story of Al Capone. Our story begins not in Chicago, but in Brooklyn, New York, in the year 1899. On January 17th, in a tenement apartment in a crowded immigrant neighborhood, Gabriele and Teresa Capone welcomed their 4th child into the world. They named him Alphonse, after his grandfather. Gabriele Capone had come to America from Italy in 1893, following the dream that brought millions across the Atlantic, the promise of a better life. He was a barber by trade, a hard-working man who believed in honest labor and the American dream. Teresa was equally hard-working, managing their large household while taking in sewing to help make ends meet. The Capones would eventually have 9 children. Alphonse, called Al by everyone, grew up in the middle of this big Italian family, in a neighborhood teeming with other immigrant families. Irish, Jewish, Polish, Italian, all crowded together in the tenements of Brooklyn. Life in these neighborhoods was hard. The apartments were small, cramped, often shared by multiple families. The streets were dirty and dangerous. Disease was common. Children had to grow up fast, or they didn't grow up at all. But these neighborhoods also had a vibrant culture. The sound of different languages filled the air. The smell of cooking from a dozen different countries wafted through the streets. And for a young boy like Al Capone, these streets were both playground and classroom, teaching lessons that no school could provide. Young Al was a bright child. He did well in his early school years, showing a quick mind and a gift for mathematics. His teachers noted that he could do complex calculations in his head faster than other children could with pencil and paper. This talent for numbers would serve him well later in life, though not in the way his parents hoped. But Al also had a temper. He was fiercely proud, unable to back down from any slight or insult. When he felt disrespected, he fought, and Al Capone was good at fighting. He was a big kid, strong for his age, and absolutely fearless. In 6th grade, at the age of 14, Al's formal education came to an end. His teacher, a woman who believed in strict discipline, struck Al for some misbehavior. Al struck back. In that era, hitting a teacher was unforgivable. Al was expelled and never returned to school. This moment was a turning point. Without education, without the discipline and structure that school provided, Al was loose on the streets full-time. And the streets of Brooklyn in 1913 were full of opportunities for a young man with no fear and a talent for violence. Al began running with street gangs, First the Brooklyn Rippers, then the 40 Thieves Juniors. These weren't the organized crime syndicates they would later become. They were groups of young men from the neighborhood, looking out for each other, marking territory, fighting rival gangs. But they were also the training ground for future criminals. Al learned the rules of the street. He learned loyalty, that you never betrayed your friends, never cooperated with the police, never broke the code of silence called omertà. He learned that respect was everything, that a man's reputation was his most valuable possession. He learned that violence, or the threat of violence, could get you what you wanted. But Al also learned legitimate skills. He worked various jobs, in a candy store, as a pin boy in a bowling alley, as a paper cutter in a bookbindery. He was a hard worker when he wanted to be, charming and personable. People liked Al Capone. He had charisma, an easy smile, a way of making people feel comfortable around him. It was during these years that Al came under the influence of a man who would change his life, Johnny Torrio. Torrio was a crime boss who ran the 5 Points Gang, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in New York. But Torrio wasn't like the street thugs young Al was used to. Torrio was sophisticated, educated, a businessman who happened to do business outside the law. Torrio saw potential in young Al Capone. He saw the intelligence, the mathematical mind, the charisma. But he also saw the willingness to use violence when necessary. Torrio took Al under his wing, teaching him that crime could be a business, that organization and planning were more valuable than mindless brutality. Al became a collector for Torrio, going door to door in the neighborhood, picking up protection money from businesses. It was a perfect job for young Capone. He was charming enough to make people like him, intimidating enough that they didn't want to refuse him, and violent enough to handle anyone who tried. Around this time, Al also began working as a bartender and bouncer at a rough dive called the Harvard Inn, owned by a gangster named Frankie Yale. It was at the Harvard Inn that Al Capone received the wound that would give him his famous nickname. The story goes like this. One night, a young woman came into the bar with her brother. Al, who fancied himself a ladies' man, made an inappropriate comment to the woman. Her brother, Frank Galluccio, took offense. Words were exchanged. Galluccio pulled a knife and slashed Al across the left side of his face, leaving 3 deep cuts that would scar permanently. Al could have had Galluccio killed for this insult. In the world he lived in, such revenge would have been expected. But Al made a different choice. He admitted he'd been in the wrong, that he'd disrespected the woman. He and Galluccio made peace. In fact, Al later hired Galluccio as a bodyguard, respecting the man who had stood up to him. The scars, however, remained. 3 distinctive lines across his left cheek. For the rest of his life, photographers would be told to shoot Al from his right side only. He hated the nickname Scarface, and anyone who used it to his face risked his legendary temper. But the scars and the nickname became part of his legend. By the time Al was 20 years old, he had a wife, May Coughlin, an Irish girl he'd met at a dance, and a son, Albert Francis Capone, born in 1918. He also had a growing reputation as a tough guy who could be trusted, who was smart with money, and who knew how to get things done. But Al's life in New York was about to change. In 1919, Johnny Torrio moved to Chicago to take over a criminal operation from his uncle. And in 1920, Torrio sent word to Al, "Come to Chicago. I need you here. There's an opportunity like nothing you've ever seen." The opportunity was Prohibition, and it would make Al Capone the most famous criminal in America. To understand Al Capone's rise to power, you need to understand Prohibition and what it did to America. On January 16th, in 1920, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution went into effect. For the first time in American history, the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages was illegal throughout the entire country. The amendment was the culmination of decades of work by the temperance movement. These reformers believed that alcohol was the root of poverty, crime, and family breakdown. They believed that if you could eliminate alcohol, you could create a more moral, more prosperous, more peaceful America. They were wrong. Spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. What Prohibition actually created was the greatest criminal opportunity in American history. Overnight, the alcohol industry worth billions of dollars went underground, and the men who controlled that underground industry became rich and powerful beyond imagination. When Al Capone arrived in Chicago in 1920, the city was already adapting to Prohibition. Speakeasies, illegal bars, were opening everywhere. Bootleggers were smuggling whiskey from Canada and rum from the Caribbean. Local brewers were operating in secret, and Johnny Torrio was positioning himself to control it all. Torrio had taken over the criminal operations of his uncle, Big Jim Colosimo, who had built an empire based on prostitution and gambling. But Colosimo didn't see the potential in bootlegging. He was old-fashioned, content with his existing operations. When Torrio tried to convince him to move into the liquor business, Colosimo refused. On May 11th, year 1920, Big Jim Colosimo was shot and killed in his own restaurant. The murder was never solved, but many believed that Torrio had ordered the hit. With Colosimo gone, Torrio took control, and he made Al Capone his right-hand man. Al arrived in Chicago as a nobody from New York. Within a few years, he would be the most powerful man in the city. Torrio and Capone set up their base of operations in Cicero, a suburb just outside Chicago. They opened speakeasies, brothels, and gambling dens. They bought breweries and distilleries. They imported whiskey from Canada, rum from the Caribbean, and beer from local brewers. They bribed police, judges, and politicians. They did whatever was necessary to protect their business and eliminate competition. Al proved to be a natural at this new enterprise. His mathematical mind was perfect for the complex bookkeeping required to run an illegal business empire. His charisma allowed him to negotiate with politicians and police, and his willingness to use violence kept everyone in line. Al also understood something that many of his fellow gangsters didn't: public relations. While other mobsters hid in the shadows, Al cultivated a public image. He wore expensive suits, custom-made in silk and cashmere. He smoked cigars, drove flashy cars, ate at the best restaurants. He gave interviews to newspapers. He donated to charities. He presented himself as a businessman, providing a service that people wanted. "I'm just a businessman," Al would tell reporters, "giving the people what they want. All I do is satisfy a public demand. 90% of the people of Cook County drink and gamble, and my offense has been to furnish them with those amusements." It was a brilliant strategy. While police and reformers railed against organized crime, ordinary Chicagoans saw Al Capone as someone who let them have a drink and a good time. He became a celebrity, famous not just in Chicago but across America. But behind the charm and the expensive suits, Al Capone was building his power through violence. In Chicago's underworld, there were other gangs competing for control of the lucrative bootlegging trade. The North Side Gang, led by men like Dean O'Banion and later Bugs Moran, controlled their own territory. The Jenner brothers ran operations on the West Side. Other smaller gangs operated throughout the city. At first, there was enough business for everyone, but as the profits grew, so did the ambitions. Territory disputes turned into open warfare. Gangsters began killing each other in the streets. Al tried to maintain peace through negotiation. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he preferred to make deals rather than war. But when negotiation failed, Al didn't hesitate to use violence. His organization carried out dozens of murders, eliminating rivals and sending messages to anyone who threatened their operations. In 1924, a major turning point occurred. Dean O'Banion, leader of the North Side Gang and one of Torrio and Capone's main rivals, was gunned down in his flower shop. The killers were never caught, but everyone knew who was responsible. O'Banion's death triggered a gang war that would consume Chicago for years. The North Siders, now led by Jaime Weiss and later Bugs Moran, wanted revenge. They went after Torrio. In January 1925, Torrio was ambushed outside his apartment building. He was shot multiple times and barely survived. When he recovered, Torrio made a decision. He was retiring. Chicago had become too violent, too dangerous. He was getting out while he still could. Torrio handed everything over to Al Capone. At the age of just 26, Al Capone became the undisputed boss of Chicago's underworld. He now controlled an organization that generated over $100 million a year, the equivalent of over $1 billion today. He commanded an army of gunmen, corrupt officials, and legitimate businessmen. He was, in every way that mattered, the king of Chicago. But with that power came responsibility. Al had to protect his empire. He had to keep his suppliers happy, his customers satisfied, his employees loyal. He had to manage complex operations involving thousands of people. And most dangerously, he had to survive the war with the North Side Gang. The violence escalated throughout the year 1925 and 1926. Gangsters were gunned down in restaurants, in their cars, on street corners. The newspapers called it the Beer Wars. Chicago was becoming infamous as the most violent city in America, and Al Capone was at the center of it all. Al moved his headquarters to the Metropole Hotel, then later to the Lexington Hotel. He surrounded himself with bodyguards, never going anywhere without armed men watching his back. He had armored cars built, with bulletproof glass and steel plating. He became essentially untouchable, protected by his money, his power, and his guns. In his private life, Al maintained a strange double existence. He had moved his wife May and their son from New York to Chicago, setting them up in a comfortable home. To them, he was a devoted husband and father. But he also had mistresses, partied at speakeasies and nightclubs, and lived a life of excess that his family never saw. Al also developed a reputation for generosity, at least to those he favored. During the harsh Chicago winters, he would open soup kitchens, feeding thousands of unemployed and homeless people. He donated to hospitals and orphanages. He gave lavish tips to waiters and newsboys. All of this enhanced his image as a modern-day Robin Hood, taking from the rich through bootlegging. But this image concealed the truth. Al Capone was a violent criminal who had ordered the deaths of dozens, probably hundreds of people. His soup kitchens and charity were public relations, designed to protect his business and maintain his power. By 1928, Al Capone was at the height of his power. He controlled most of Chicago's bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution. He had politicians and police on his payroll. He lived like a king, spending money on parties, cars, clothes, and jewelry. He was the most famous gangster in America, his face on the cover of Time magazine. But Al's enemies were still out there, still plotting. The North Side Gang, led by Bugs Moran, continued to challenge his supremacy. Territories were disputed, shipments were hijacked, men were killed. Al decided it was time to end this war once and for all. He began planning what would become the most infamous mob hit in American history, an event that would shock the nation and, ironically, begin the end of Al Capone's reign. The event was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. February 14th, year 1929, Valentine's Day. A day for love, for romance, for flowers and chocolates. But in Chicago, this Valentine's Day would become synonymous with cold-blooded murder. The North Side Gang, led by Bugs Moran, operated out of a garage at 2122 North Clark Street. This garage was used to store hijacked whiskey and to plan operations against Capone's organization. Bugs Moran himself frequently met with his top men there to discuss business. Al Capone had been planning for weeks. He wanted to eliminate the North Side Gang's leadership in one decisive strike. If he could kill Moran and his top lieutenants all at once, the war would be over. The North Side would have no leadership, no organization. They would collapse, and Al would control all of Chicago. The plan was complex but brilliant. One of Capone's men arranged to sell Bugs Moran a shipment of hijacked whiskey at a good price. The shipment was to be delivered to the garage on North Clark Street, on the morning of February 14th. Moran and his men would be there, waiting for the delivery. And that's when Capone's killers would strike. Al himself made sure he had an alibi. He traveled to Florida, to his estate in Palm Island, making sure he was seen by plenty of witnesses. When the massacre happened, Al Capone would be hundreds of miles away, relaxing in the sunshine. On the morning of February 14th, 7 men gathered in the garage on North Clark Street. There was Adam Heyer, the gang's bookkeeper, Albert Kachelik, and Albert Weinshank. Enforcers, John May, a mechanic who worked for the gang, Reinhard Schwimmer, an optometrist who hung around gangsters because he found them exciting, and 2 brothers, Frank and Peter Gusenberg, who were Moran's top gunmen. Notably absent was Bugs Moran himself. He was running late that morning, delayed by some small errand. If he'd been on time, he would have died with his men. Instead, his tardiness saved his life. At around 10:30 inches the morning, a car pulled up outside the garage. It was designed to look like a police car. 4 men got out, 2 dressed as Chicago police officers, 2 in civilian clothes. The men entered the garage. Inside, the 7 men waiting for their whiskey shipment saw what appeared to be police officers. This wasn't unusual. Police raids on speakeasies and illegal operations happened all the time. Usually, it just meant a bribe would have to be paid and everyone would go free. The 7 men put their hands up and faced the wall, assuming this was just a routine shakedown. They were wrong. The 4 killers, actually members of Capone's organization disguised as police, lined up their victims against the brick wall. Then they opened fire. The garage erupted with the sound of Tommy gun fire. 70 bullets in just a few seconds. The .45 caliber bullets tore through the 7 men, killing most of them instantly. When the shooting stopped, the killers calmly walked out of the garage. The 2 dressed as civilians walked out first, their hands up, as if they were being arrested. The 2 dressed as police followed, guns drawn, as if they were the arresting officers. The killers drove away, and in the garage on North Clark Street, 7 men lay dead or dying in pools of blood. One man, Frank Gusenberg, somehow survived the initial barrage despite being shot 14 times. When real police arrived at the scene, they found Gusenberg still alive, though barely. They asked him who had shot him. Gusenberg, following the gangster code to the very end, said, "Nobody shot me. He died 3 hours later." The street Valentine's Day massacre shocked America. The brutality of it, the cold-blooded execution style, the sheer number of victims, it was beyond anything the public had seen before. Newspapers across the country ran the story on their front pages. Photographs of the bloody garage and the covered bodies horrified readers. Public opinion began to turn against Al Capone. Before the massacre, many people had viewed him as a colorful character, a bootlegger giving people what they wanted. But this was different. This was mass murder. This was something out of a war zone, not a civilized city. The police investigation was immediate and intense. They knew Al Capone was behind it. Everyone knew, but proving it was another matter. Al had his alibi. He'd been in Florida. The killers were never positively identified. No physical evidence directly linked the crime to Capone's organization. Bugs Moran, who had escaped death by arriving late, gave a statement to the press that summed up everyone's thoughts. Only Capone kills like that. Al Capone, from his Florida estate, denied everything. He expressed shock and sadness at the violence. He claimed he was just a businessman, not a killer. But nobody believed him. The massacre had Al Capone's fingerprints all over it, even if he'd never pulled a trigger himself. Ironically, the massacre accomplished its goal while also beginning Capone's downfall. The North Side gang was essentially destroyed. Bugs Moran survived but never regained his power. Without effective rivals, Al Capone controlled Chicago more completely than ever before. But the heat on Al had become intense. The massacre had embarrassed Chicago. made it a national joke. Politicians who had been happy to accept bribes from Capone now had to show they were doing something about crime. The press demanded action. Even President Herbert Hoover took an interest, reportedly saying that Al Capone needed to be brought down. The Chicago police couldn't or wouldn't touch Capone, too many of them were on his payroll. But the federal government was a different matter. The FBI and the Treasury Department began looking for ways to prosecute Al Capone. They didn't care about bootlegging or murder, those were state crimes, hard to prove, easy to bribe your way out of. They wanted something federal, something that would stick, something that Capone's money and influence couldn't make disappear. They found it in the most mundane of crimes, tax evasion. Al Capone, like most criminals of his era, didn't file income tax returns. Why would he? His income was illegal. You couldn't exactly declare bootlegging profits on your taxes. But the government didn't care where the money came from. If you had income, you had to pay taxes on it. And if you didn't pay taxes, they could prosecute you. The government assigned their best agents to build a case against Capone. Eliot Ness and his untouchables went after Capone's breweries, trying to cut off his income and make him desperate. Meanwhile, Treasury agents worked to prove that Capone had massive income and had paid no taxes. But Al wasn't worried. Not yet. He'd beaten legal troubles before. He had the best lawyers money could buy. He had judges and politicians in his pocket. How dangerous could some accountants be? He was about to find out. By 1930, Al Capone's position seemed unassailable. He'd eliminated or intimidated most of his rivals. He controlled vast territories in Chicago and surrounding areas. His wealth was staggering. Estimates suggested he was making over $100 million a year, making him one of the richest men in America, though all of it was illegal. But cracks were beginning to show in the empire Al had built. The Street Valentine's Day massacre, while eliminating his enemies, had made Al Capone too famous, too notorious. He couldn't go anywhere without being recognized. Newspapers followed his every move. Reformers used him as the symbol of everything wrong with America. He'd become a liability to the corrupt politicians who'd protected him for years. They now had to distance themselves or face public outrage. President Herbert Hoover, facing economic collapse from the Great Depression, wanted to show he was tough on crime. He made prosecuting Al Capone a priority. "I want that man Capone in jail," Hoover reportedly said. The full weight of the federal government began bearing down on Chicago's underworld king. The government's strategy was two-pronged. First, there was Eliot Ness and his team of Prohibition agents, who became known as the Untouchables because they couldn't be bribed. Ness and his men raided Capone's breweries, destroyed his equipment, arrested his workers. They were a constant harassment, costing Al money and prestige. But the real threat came from the Treasury Department and a team of accountants and agents led by Frank Wilson. These men weren't interested in dramatic raids or shootouts. They were interested in numbers. They began building a case that Al Capone had earned substantial income and had paid no income tax on any of it. The challenge was proving how much money Al made. Capone kept no legitimate records. He didn't have a bank account in his own name. He dealt in cash. He never signed anything. He was, in many ways, invisible on paper. But Frank Wilson and his team were patient and thorough. They tracked down every bit of evidence they could find. They interviewed witnesses. They examined records from businesses Capone controlled. They looked at his spending, the expensive suits, the cars, the jewelry, the parties. All of that money had to come from somewhere. In 1930, the government got a break. They found a ledger that showed payments to various members of Capone's organization. The handwriting was identified as belonging to one of Capone's accountants. This ledger proved that large sums of money were flowing through Capone's organization. They also found evidence of Capone's lavish spending. Al had purchased a mansion in Palm Island, Florida, for $40,000 in cash. He'd spent $50,000 on furniture. He threw parties that cost thousands. He wore suits that cost more than most people made in a year. All of this spending was documented, photographed, recorded. The government's case was simple. Al Capone lived like a millionaire. The money had to come from somewhere. Since he filed no tax returns, he was evading taxes on whatever income he had. The exact amount didn't even matter. If they could prove substantial income and no taxes paid, they had him. Al initially wasn't worried. Tax evasion seemed like a minor charge, especially compared to the murders and other violent crimes he'd committed. His lawyers assured him they could beat it, or at least negotiate a light sentence. Al believed he could bribe or intimidate his way out of trouble, just like he always had. But something else was happening that Al didn't fully appreciate. The country was changing. The Great Depression had begun in 1929. And by 1930, millions of Americans were out of work, homeless, starving. While ordinary people stood in breadlines, Al Capone lived in luxury, his wealth built on illegal activities. The public was no longer amused by colorful gangsters. They were angry. Newspapers began running stories about how much tax revenue the government was losing because of people like Capone. At a time when every dollar was needed to help depression victims, here was a criminal making millions and paying nothing. The public wanted Al Capone punished, and they didn't care how it happened. In March 1931, a federal grand jury indicted Al Capone on charges of income tax evasion. The indictment alleged that between the year 1925 and 1929, Capone had earned over $1 million and had paid no income tax on any of it. Shortly after, he was indicted on 5,000 violations of the Volstead Act, the law that enforced Prohibition. Al's lawyers worked out a plea deal. Al would plead guilty and receive a sentence of 2.5 years. For someone who'd committed dozens of murders and run a criminal empire, 2.5 years seemed like nothing. Al was confident he'd beaten the system again. But at the hearing, something unexpected happened. The judge, James Herbert Wilkerson, refused to accept the plea bargain. He stated that he wasn't bound by any agreement between prosecutors and defense. He would decide the sentence based on the evidence, and it might be much longer than 2.5 years. Al Capone was in trouble, and he knew it. He changed his plea to not guilty and prepared to fight the case in court. The trial began in October 1931. The prosecution presented their evidence methodically. They showed Capone's spending. They showed the ledgers. They brought witnesses who testified about Capone's lavish lifestyle. They proved that Capone had earned substantial income and had filed no tax returns. The defense argued that the government couldn't prove exactly how much money Capone made. They argued that much of what prosecutors claimed was Capone's income was actually gifts or loans. They tried to discredit witnesses, but the evidence was overwhelming. Al tried one more trick. He'd bribed the jury. His organization had identified all the jurors and paid them off. He was confident that regardless of the evidence, the jury would find him not guilty or at least deadlock. But Judge Wilkerson had suspected this might happen. On the morning the trial was set to begin, he switched juries with another judge. The jurors who walked into the courtroom weren't the ones Capone had bribed. They were different people entirely. Al's fix was useless. For one of the few times in his life, Al Capone looked worried. The trial lasted 11 days. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. When they returned, they had a verdict: guilty on 5 of the 23 counts of tax evasion. Judge Wilkerson sentenced Al Capone to 11 years in federal prison, the longest sentence ever imposed for tax evasion at that time. He also imposed $50,000 in fines and ordered Capone to pay $30,000 in back taxes and court costs. Al Capone, the man who had ruled Chicago, who had built an empire, who had seemed untouchable, was going to prison, and not to a comfortable county jail where he could buy privileges, but to federal prison where his money and influence meant much less. On May 4th, year 1932, Al Capone began serving his sentence at the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta. The King of Chicago was now prisoner number 40886. But Al's story wasn't over yet. In fact, the worst was still to come. When Al Capone entered the Atlanta penitentiary in May 1932, he tried to make the best of a bad situation. Prison was unpleasant, certainly, but Al had been in tight spots before. He was confident he could serve his time and then return to Chicago to reclaim his empire. And at first, things weren't so bad. Even in federal prison, Al's money and reputation carried weight. He received special privileges, a comfortable cell, better food, visits from family and associates. He essentially ran parts of the prison, bribing guards and intimidating other inmates. In some ways, he was still living like a boss, just in a smaller kingdom. But the federal government wasn't happy with this arrangement. They'd gone to great lengths to convict Al Capone, and they didn't want him essentially vacationing in prison. They wanted him truly punished, his power completely broken. In August 1934, Al Capone and several other high-profile criminals were transferred to a new prison facility, a facility specifically designed to hold America's most dangerous and incorrigible criminals, a facility where money couldn't buy privileges, where reputation meant nothing, where the only rule was absolute obedience to the guards. That facility was Alcatraz. Alcatraz Island sits in San Francisco Bay, surrounded by cold water and treacherous currents. The island had been a military prison before being converted into a federal penitentiary. It was chosen specifically because it was escape-proof. The water was too cold and the currents too strong for anyone to swim to the mainland. The facility was designed with maximum security in mind: guard towers, electronic metal detectors, gun galleries where guards could watch prisoners without being reached. Alcatraz was meant to break the spirits of men who thought they were above the law. And one of its first and most famous residents was Al Capone. Al arrived at Alcatraz on August 22nd, year 1934. He was now prisoner number 85. On Alcatraz, there were no special privileges. Guards couldn't be bribed. They were specifically chosen for their integrity and were paid well to resist corruption. Violence against guards was met with severe punishment. The rules were absolute and applied equally to everyone. For Al Capone, who had spent years living as a king, this was a devastating change. He was just another number now. Just another convict. Guards didn't care that he'd once ruled Chicago. Other prisoners weren't intimidated by his reputation. Many of them had similar reputations. Al tried to adjust. He worked in the prison laundry. He followed the rules. For the most part, he kept his head down and tried to serve his time quietly. But prison was wearing on him, physically and mentally, and something else was happening. Something Al didn't initially understand. He was getting sick. Years earlier, long before he became famous, Al Capone had contracted syphilis. This was a common disease in that era, especially among men who frequented prostitutes as Al had in his youth. Syphilis was treatable with the right medicines, but Al had never been properly treated. He'd either ignored the symptoms or been too embarrassed to seek help. Untreated syphilis progresses through stages. The initial symptoms fade, and the victim might think they're cured, but the disease remains in the body, quietly doing damage. Years or decades later, in the final stage, it attacks the brain and nervous system, causing dementia, paralysis, and eventually death. By the time Al entered Alcatraz, he was in the late stages of syphilis. The disease was eating away at his brain. He began experiencing confusion, memory loss, and mood swings. His speech became slurred. He would forget where he was or why he was there. Other prisoners began to notice. Al Capone, once the most feared gangster in America, was becoming an object of pity. Guards found him confused in his cell, not remembering basic information. He would have conversations with people who weren't there. His mind was deteriorating rapidly. Prison doctors diagnosed the syphilis, but by this point, there was little they could do. Penicillin, which would later become an effective treatment for syphilis, hadn't been discovered yet. The disease was incurable and fatal. Al spent 3 years on Alcatraz, from year 1934 to 1937, and during that time, he deteriorated rapidly. The man who had once controlled Chicago, who had commanded armies of gunmen, who had lived in luxury and power, now wandered the prison corridors confused and disoriented. In February 1938, Al's condition had deteriorated so much that he was transferred back to the federal prison in Los Angeles, and then to Terminal Island Prison. He was a sick, broken man who posed no threat to anyone. Prison officials conducted tests and confirmed what everyone suspected. Al Capone had neurosyphilis, and his mental capacity was severely diminished. He had the mental age of a 12-year-old child. The disease had destroyed parts of his brain irreversibly. On November 16th, year 1939, after serving 7.5 years of his 11-year sentence, Al Capone was released from prison. He'd earned time off for good behavior and because prison officials recognized he was no longer dangerous. He was 40 years old. But he looked much older. His hair had gone grey. His face was lined and haggard. His body weakened. The once mighty Al Capone left prison not as a king, but as a shell of his former self. Al Capone's release from prison in November 1939 should have been a moment of triumph. After 7.5 years behind bars, he was finally free to return to his family, to enjoy his wealth, perhaps even to reclaim some of his former power. But the man who walked out of Terminal Island Prison was nothing like the man who had entered the Atlanta Penitentiary 7 years earlier. Al Capone was physically and mentally destroyed. The syphilis had ravaged his brain. He could barely have a conversation. He often didn't recognize people he'd known for years. He would become confused about where he was or what year it was. Al's wife May picked him up from prison and took him directly to their estate in Palm Island, Florida. The mansion sat on a beautiful piece of waterfront property, surrounded by palm trees and tropical gardens. It was a paradise, a place where Al could have enjoyed his remaining years in peace and comfort. But for Al, it became a prison of a different kind. He was essentially under house arrest, not by the government, but by his own failing health. He couldn't leave the property without causing a spectacle. Reporters would photograph him, write stories about his condition. Former rivals and enemies were still out there, and Al was now vulnerable, unable to defend himself. May became his caretaker, along with a small staff of loyal servants. They watched over Al, managed his affairs, tried to maintain his dignity. It was a sad role reversal. The man who had once protected and provided for everyone now needed to be protected and cared for like a child. Al's mental state continued to deteriorate. He would sit by the pool for hours, fishing in the water even when there were no fish. He played cards but couldn't remember the rules. He listened to music on his phonograph, the same songs over and over. Sometimes he thought he was back in Chicago, running his empire. He would call out orders to associates who weren't there, plan operations for organizations that no longer existed. His family tried to keep his condition private, but word leaked out. Newspapers ran stories about Al Capone's decline. Some were sympathetic, portraying him as a tragic figure brought down by disease. Others were gleeful, seeing poetic justice in the mighty gangster reduced to this pathetic state. Occasionally, Al would have moments of clarity. In these brief windows, he seemed to understand what had happened to him, what he had become. Those moments were perhaps the most tragic of all, to be aware, even briefly, of how far he had fallen. The criminal empire Al had built crumbled without him. His organization had been held together by his personality, his leadership, his ruthless enforcement of loyalty. With Al gone, his lieutenants fought among themselves for control. Some were killed in gang wars, others were arrested. The organization fractured, and eventually dissolved. Chicago itself was changing. Prohibition was repealed in 1933, taking away the primary source of illegal profit that had funded the mob's power. The violence that had made Chicago infamous in the years 1920 gradually subsided. New criminal organizations emerged, but none had the power or notoriety of Al Capone's outfit. In some ways, Al Capone's era died with his imprisonment. The freewheeling, violent days of Prohibition-era gangsterism gave way to more subtle, sophisticated, organized crime. The flamboyant gangster celebrity was replaced by quiet bosses who stayed out of the spotlight. But Al himself knew nothing of these changes. In his deteriorating mind, he was still the boss, still in control, still living in the glory days when he ruled Chicago. His family did what they could to make him comfortable. His son Albert, now an adult, visited regularly, though it broke his heart to see his father this way. May remained devoted, caring for Al even when he didn't recognize her. His siblings visited when they could, reminiscing about the old days in Brooklyn, though Al rarely remembered those times clearly. Doctors tried various treatments, but nothing could reverse the damage the syphilis had done. The disease had destroyed too much of his brain tissue. The best they could hope for was to slow the progression and keep Al comfortable. Al's condition worsened. He suffered small strokes. His speech became even more impaired. He developed infections that a healthy person would fight off easily, but which, in his weakened state, became serious threats. On January 21st, year 1947, Al suffered a stroke at his Palm Island estate. He seemed to recover somewhat, but then developed bronchopneumonia, a complication of the stroke. His condition deteriorated rapidly. Al Capone's family gathered around him. May was there, as she'd been throughout the entire ordeal. His son Albert held his father's hand. His brother Ralph, who had served his own prison time for tax evasion, came to say goodbye. On January 25th, year 1947, at 7:25 in the evening, Al Capone died. He was 48 years old. The man who had once been America's most famous criminal died quietly in his bedroom, surrounded by family, far from the violence and notoriety that had defined his life. The newspapers ran obituaries, recounting his rise and fall, his crimes, and his punishment. But the man they described seemed like someone from ancient history, a figure from a different era. Al Capone's funeral was held in Chicago, the city he had once ruled. Despite the cold January weather, thousands of people lined the streets to watch the funeral procession. Some came out of respect, remembering the soup kitchens and charity Al had provided during the Depression. Others came out of curiosity, wanting to see the end of a legend. Still others came to make sure he was really dead, that the man who had terrorized Chicago was truly gone. Al was buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago, in the family plot next to his father and brother. Later, the family would have him moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, where he rests today alongside other family members. The grave is simple, marked with a modest headstone that reads, Alphonse Capone, year 1899 to 1947. My Jesus mercy. It's a quiet resting place for a man who lived such a loud life. More than 75 years after his death, Al Capone remains one of the most famous criminals in American history. His name is instantly recognizable, even to people who know little about the actual history of organized crime. He has become a symbol, an archetype, the American gangster. But what exactly is Al Capone's legacy? What did his life mean? And what lessons can we draw from his story? On one level, Al Capone's story is uniquely American. He was the son of immigrants, growing up in poverty in a Brooklyn tenement. In many ways, he embodied the American dream. Through hard work, intelligence, and ruthless ambition, he rose from nothing to become one of the richest and most powerful men in America. Of course, he achieved this through crime, through violence, through breaking every rule. But the arc of his rise follows the classic American success story. Prohibition created Al Capone. Without the 18th Amendment, without that noble experiment that made alcohol illegal, Al would have likely remained a small-time criminal in New York. But Prohibition created an opportunity unlike anything before or since, a massive market for an illegal product, worth billions of dollars, with minimal organized law enforcement. Al had the intelligence and ruthlessness to seize that opportunity. He understood that bootlegging was a business, not just a crime. He organized it like a corporation, with different divisions handling different aspects of the operation. He invested in infrastructure, breweries, distilleries, transportation networks. He diversified into other ventures, gambling, prostitution, nightclubs. He understood marketing and public relations, cultivating an image that made him famous rather than just notorious. In a legitimate business world, Al Capone might have been celebrated as a visionary entrepreneur, but his business was built on violence, corruption, and human suffering. The violence of Al's reign is staggering when you really examine it. During the beer wars of the 1920s, hundreds of people were killed in Chicago. Most were criminals killing other criminals, but innocent people died too, caught in crossfires, mistaken for targets, or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Street Valentine's Day Massacre was just the most famous incident. There were dozens of other murders, beatings, kidnappings. Al Capone ordered these killings. He may not have pulled the trigger himself, though early in his career he certainly did, but every murder carried out by his organization happened because he approved it, or because his subordinates knew he would approve it. Al had blood on his hands, gallons of it. Yet, Al also gave to charity, opened soup kitchens, presented himself as a friend to the common man. This contradiction is part of what makes him fascinating. He wasn't a simple villain. He was complex, containing multitudes, generous and cruel, charming and terrifying, a devoted family man and a ruthless killer. Some historians and cultural commentators have tried to romanticize Al Capone, to see him as a Robin Hood figure or a rebel against unjust laws. After all, most Americans didn't support Prohibition. They wanted to drink, and Al provided them that service. He argued he was just a businessman giving people what they wanted. But this romanticization ignores the reality of what Al actually did. He wasn't stealing from the rich to give to the poor. He was making himself rich by selling alcohol at inflated prices and eliminating competition through murder. His soup kitchens, while genuinely helpful to people during the Depression, were also public relations exercises designed to make it harder for authorities to prosecute him. The truth is that Al Capone was a criminal who caused enormous harm to society. The violence, the corruption of public officials, the contempt for law and order, these things had real consequences for real people. Chicago in the 1920s was a dangerous place, and Al Capone was a major reason why. His downfall through tax evasion has become legendary and has shaped how law enforcement approaches organized crime ever since. The government learned an important lesson. When you can't get criminals on their main crimes, find another angle. Tax evasion, money laundering, corruption charges, these became powerful tools for federal prosecutors. The Al Capone approach of using tax laws to bring down criminals has been employed countless times since. It's how federal authorities went after many mob bosses in the decades following Capone's conviction. It's a reminder that, in a society of laws, there are many ways to hold criminals accountable. Al Capone's influence on popular culture is perhaps more significant than his actual historical impact. He became the template for the American gangster in movies, television, and literature. From James Cagney in The Public Enemy to Robert De Niro's portrayal of Al himself in The Untouchables, from The Godfather to The Sopranos, Al Capone's shadow looms over. Every gangster story, these fictional portrayals, often glamorize the gangster life, making it seem exciting and romantic. They focus on the power, the money, the respect, the excitement. They tend to gloss over the reality, the paranoia, the violence, the betrayals, the inevitable doom. Al Capone's actual life shows the reality. Yes, he had a few years of power and wealth, but he also spent 7.5 years in prison, with 3 of those years on Alcatraz in harsh conditions. Then he spent 7.5 more years as a mental invalid, unable to enjoy his freedom or his wealth. He died at 48, his mind destroyed, his empire gone, his legacy forever tied to violence and crime. Was it worth it? Would Al himself, if he'd had a moment of clarity before his death, say that his choices had been good ones? We can't know for certain, but we can guess. Al Capone spent his last years occasionally thinking he was back in Chicago, giving orders that no one followed, reliving glory days that had passed. His son grew up with the stigma of being Al Capone's child, having to change his name to escape his father's shadow. His wife spent years caring for a man whose mind was gone. His organization dissolved into warfare and arrests. The money, the power, the fame, it all proved temporary. There's another aspect of Al Capone's legacy worth considering. What his rise says about American society in the 1920s. How did one man, a criminal, come to essentially control a major American city? How did he bribe police, judges, politicians? How did he operate openly, throwing parties, giving interviews, living in luxury while everyone knew he was a criminal? The answer is that Al Capone didn't exist in isolation. He was enabled by a corrupt system, by police who took bribes, by politicians who made deals, by citizens who were willing to look the other way as long as they got their drink. Prohibition was a law that large portions of the public didn't support and actively violated. This created an environment where criminals like Capone could thrive. When the system is corrupt, when laws are unjust or unenforced, when people lose faith in institutions, criminals will step in to fill the void. Al Capone didn't create Chicago's corruption, he exploited it. He was smart enough to see the opportunity and ruthless enough to seize it. The eventual reform that came to Chicago, the crackdown on organized crime, the prosecution of corrupt officials, the repeal of Prohibition, showed that when society decides to enforce its laws and clean up its institutions, even powerful criminals can be brought down. Today, Al Capone's mansion in Palm Island still stands. It's a private residence, occasionally toured by curious visitors. The Lexington Hotel in Chicago, where Al kept his headquarters, was demolished in 1995. Mount Carmel Cemetery, where Al is buried, gets regular visitors who want to see the final resting place of America's most famous gangster. Museums display artifacts from Al's life, his gun, his diamond-studded belt buckle, photographs of his estate. Documentaries are made about him. Books are written, analyzing his life and times. Tours in Chicago visit sites associated with the Street Valentine's Day Massacre and other Capone-related events. All of this keeps Al Capone's memory alive, keeps him famous. In that sense, Al got what he wanted. Immortality, a place in history, a name that won't be forgotten. But the price he paid for that fame was everything that mattered. As we come to the end of Al Capone's story, it's worth reflecting on what his life teaches us about crime, about power, about the choices we make and the consequences that follow. Al Capone was born with nothing, a poor immigrant child in a crowded tenement. Through intelligence and ruthless ambition, he built an empire. He lived like a king, with wealth beyond imagination. He had power that let him control a major American city. He was famous, his name known across the country and around the world. But every choice he made, every step he took toward that power and wealth, came with a price. The violence he ordered haunted Chicago for years. The corruption he spread poisoned the city's institutions. The empire he built was constructed on a foundation of blood and suffering. And in the end, what did he have? 7.5 years in prison, including some of the harshest conditions imaginable on Alcatraz. Then 7.5 years as a shell of himself, his mind destroyed by disease, unable to enjoy his freedom or his wealth. He died at 48, far younger than he should have, having spent more than a third of his adult life either imprisoned or mentally incapacitated. His wife, May, lived until the year 1986, dying at the age of 89. She never remarried, remaining devoted to Al's memory despite everything. She spent decades defending his legacy, trying to present him as a good man who'd made mistakes. It's a testament to love, certainly, but also to the cost that Al's choices imposed on the people who cared about him. His son Albert changed his last name to avoid the stigma of being Al Capone's child. He lived a quiet life, trying to escape his father's shadow. The Capone name, which Al had made famous, became a burden for his descendants to carry. The organization Al built dissolved after his imprisonment. The men who'd been loyal to him fought among themselves, were arrested, or simply faded into obscurity. The empire that had seemed so powerful, so permanent, lasted barely a decade after Al's arrest. Chicago recovered from the violence of the beer wars. Prohibition was repealed. New laws and better law enforcement reduced the power of organized crime. The city that Al had essentially ruled moved on, consigning him to history. So what was it all for? What did Al Capone's life amount to? If you measure success by money, Al succeeded. He made millions, lived in luxury, enjoyed pleasures that most people only dream of. But he couldn't keep the money. He spent his last years unable to even understand what money was for. If you measure success by power, Al succeeded. He controlled Chicago, commanded armies of men, made politicians bow to his will. But that power was temporary, lasting only as long as he could maintain it through violence and intimidation. The moment he couldn't enforce his will, the power evaporated. If you measure success by fame, Al succeeded. He became one of the most famous Americans of his era, his name known decades after his death. But fame for what? For killing people, for breaking laws, for building an empire on human misery. Is that the kind of fame worth having? If you measure success by leaving the world better than you found it, Al failed utterly. He made Chicago more violent, more corrupt. He caused suffering to countless people. His legacy is a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the illusion of power gained through crime. The tragic irony of Al Capone's life is that he had genuine talents. His mathematical mind, his organizational abilities, his charisma and leadership. These could have made him successful in legitimate business. If he'd applied those talents to legal enterprises, he might have become wealthy without the violence, famous without the notoriety, powerful without the corruption. But Al chose the criminal path. Perhaps he thought it was faster, easier. Perhaps he was influenced by the criminals he met in his youth. Perhaps the legitimate world seemed closed to a poor Italian immigrant kid from Brooklyn. Or perhaps Al was simply drawn to the excitement, the danger, the thrill of breaking rules and getting away with it. Whatever the reason, Al Capone's choices led him to a life of crime. And that life of crime led him to prison, disease, and an early death. The path that seemed to lead to power and glory actually led to destruction. There's a broader lesson here about Prohibition itself. The 18th Amendment was meant to make America more moral, more prosperous, more peaceful. Instead, it created a massive criminal industry, enriched gangsters like Al Capone, led to thousands of deaths from violence and from poisonous illegal alcohol, and fostered corruption throughout government and law enforcement. Prohibition shows what happens when laws are passed that large portions of the population don't support and won't obey. Such laws create opportunity for criminals and contempt for the entire legal system. When Prohibition was finally repealed in the year 1933, it was an admission that the noble experiment had failed, that sometimes the cure is worse than the disease. Al Capone was a product of his time. The 1920s were a unique moment in American history. The post-World War I boom, the Jazz Age, the modernization of society, the tensions between traditional values and modern life. Prohibition was part of that tension, an attempt to impose traditional morality on a society that was rapidly changing. Al saw the opportunity that Prohibition created and seized it. In another era, he might have remained a small-time criminal, but the 1920s made him possible. The times created Al Capone as much as Al Capone shaped the times. As you think about falling asleep tonight, think about choices and consequences. Think about how the decisions we make, even small ones, can echo through our lives and the lives of those around us. Think about how the pursuit of power and wealth, if not tempered by morality and law, can lead to destruction. Al Capone thought he was building an empire. He thought he was creating something that would last, that would make him immortal. And in a sense, he did achieve immortality. His name is still remembered, his story still told. But it's not the immortality he imagined. He's remembered not as a hero, but as a cautionary tale. Not as a success, but as a warning. The streets of Chicago are quiet now, peaceful compared to the violent days of the 1920s. The speakeasies are long gone, replaced by legal bars and restaurants. The gang warfare that consumed the city has faded into history. The beer trucks that Al's men once hijacked now make their deliveries legally and peacefully. Life goes on. Cities heal. History judges. And Al Capone, who once ruled Chicago like a king, lies in a cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, his grave marked by a simple stone, his empire dissolved into memory, his legacy reduced to a warning about the price of power gained through crime. Rest now, and let the ghosts of the roaring 20s fade into the past where they belong. The story of Scarface, of Al Capone, of Chicago's king of crime, is finished. The jazz has stopped playing. The speakeasies are closed. The Tommy guns are silent. And in the end, as with all of us, what remains is not the wealth or the power or the fame, but the choices we made and the lives we touched. Al Capone's choices led to violence and suffering. His life touched many, but rarely for the better. Let his story remind us that real success isn't measured in money or power, but in how we treat others, in the good we do, in the legacy of kindness and integrity we leave behind. Sleep well, knowing that the violent days of Al Capone's Chicago are long past, that justice, though sometimes slow, eventually prevails, and that the choices we make today will echo into tomorrow. The story is complete. The legend is told. And now, there is only silence, and rest, and the lessons of history to guide us forward.